Hi, Helen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, John.
Well, it's my pleasure. I was perusing your website, Dr. Helen McKibben. You are a psychologist?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Psychology is one of my favorite subject in history as well. So you have a podcast. I was listening to some of your excerpts from your audiobook. I guess that's what you have on your podcast. And we'll be talking about all that kind of stuff, especially your book, which is what this show is all about. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, where you're from, and what got you to the point to take an interest in psychology and then ultimately to write a book?
Well, thank you for asking. It is an interesting history. I was raised on the West Coast of the United States. I went into college not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. And I bumped into, as you know, in the 70s, and everyone was studying mind-body medicine. But what I did, since I was from a medical background, instead of just focusing on breathing and relaxing techniques and mindfulness and meditation, I went the route of studying neuroscience as much as I could to understand how the brain works when we are applying any method that has us reduce feelings physically or emotionally, and in particular, how to make good decisions based on how the brain works emotionally.
Mm-hmm. Neuroscience. How old is that discipline and that study? Like it seems like a fairly new subject.
It actually isn't. It was very relevant in the study in the 70s. I actually studied with a uh, neuroscience person, neurologist, um, at UCLA when I was just beginning my master's work. And the theories have been there for centuries, but we're changing the name and using neuroscience now than other explanations that may have been used before.
Mhm.
And I really love that because neuroscience is so important in helping people understand why they're doing what they're doing and
Hmm.
how to change it if they're not happy with it.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I was referring to is in the 80s, they invented the MRI machine. I know because I have MRIs yearly because I had a brain aneurysm 7 years ago, so they're still checking on my brain. And also, antidepressants became a thing, I think, in the 80s and became a very big thing in the 90s. Is that all part of the neuroscience studies as well?
Um, we're going to segue to my first experience with neuroscience was teaching people how to use a machine to indicate that they had the onset of a triggered feeling. And that was machines that they would strap people into, and they would notice when they were triggered to feel by various situations, stimulations. And that was the first indicator that there was a physical reaction that you could immediately identify in ourselves when we were triggered by people, situations, or thoughts. I'm adding all those words. Those
Wow.
words were not relevant back there when they had that device that they used to branch out and notice the physiology of triggered feeling, indicating brain activity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, I'm 67 years old, and there are moments in my life where I think back to a time going, back then in August 82, I made that decision, and that cost me, if I had not made that decision, I should have been more careful. It happens with age, I suppose. And you mentioned decision making. Talk about that and how can we make better decisions?
Well, let's reference everyone, you and everyone else who's listening today, and ask one simple question. Have you ever walked away from a situation and said, why didn't I listen to myself? I knew this was going to happen, our knowing. All of us has done that. Some people don't and some people do, but that's an introduction to the whole purpose behind my book and teaching people a methodology to change that, oh, why didn't I listen to myself? To give people instead a method to listen to themselves every time they are approached with a person or a situation or a trigger or second guessing themselves, how do they get back to staying with their knowing that the brain puts together
Right.
automatically, by the
Yeah.
way,
Hmm.
long enough to make decisions? So your listeners might want to know a little bit about, what does she mean? How do you tap into the neuroscience? How do you tap into that knowing that I say the brain is already designed to do? How does that occur or not occur?
Right. And that's explained in your book.
Yes.
Mm, okay.
So either we we all grow up. We all have a brain that has the exact same ability to listen to that knowing and make decisions. But what changes is our upbringing. It will determine if we go into adulthood trusting those words and making decisions based on ourselves, or not trusting ourselves. And this is
Hmm.
how it happens, very simply and generally.
Yeah. Yeah.
We never criticize parents, by the way, but if a child is growing up in the first 5 years of development and they have a feeling reaction or read of a situation like it's tense, or an idea of something they really want to do, if the parent, the people around them reinforce, yeah, oh, I felt that way too, or oh, yes, it is tense, or what a great idea, have fun and let me know how it works out. Within 2 to 5 years, the brain strengthens a neuron track to trust listening to how they feel, what they observe, and what they want to do.
Right.
And those children go into adulthood trusting the way they feel to make decisions, trusting their read of a situation and following through with it, and listening to and following through with their ideas.
Yeah.
In opposition, not blaming parents because parents parent us or caregivers parent us the way they were parented.
Yeah.
If the child has a feeling reaction, Johnny's hitting me over the head, and the parent doesn't say, oh, I felt that way. They say, well, why didn't you punch him in the nose? And what did you do wrong? The
Yeah.
child walks away second guessing themselves. Well, I guess I wasn't angry, but I'm supposed to do something different instead. I should
Mm,
have punched him in the nose. Or
mm,
if the child goes into mom and says, hey, mom, it's really tense in the house right now. What's going on? And mom goes, oh, no, 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 it's not tense. You're making me tense. Go play.
yeah.
The child walks away second guessing themselves. Well, I thought it was tense, but man, there must be something wrong with me.
Mm,
Hey, mom and dad, I want to build a kite that looks like the Washington Monument. And the parents say, terrific idea, but be sure you do it this way so you'll get first prize. And the child's idea might be taken over or the outcome controlled by the parent. Now, what happens to those children, even though they love their parents very much and vice versa? The children flip into a dependency first on reading the parents because they shut down listening to themselves. There's not enough reinforcement. And then they go into adulthood, first reading the parents and then reading other people for what they should feel, what they should do, and what they should say
mm,
instead of themselves. And
mm,
that causes difficulty
okay.
because they're not tapping into and using their own brain and experience and feelings and memories to make decisions, which I'll talk about a little later. They're reading other people.
Hmm. Well, this book, who's it for? The people who are currently adults and are suffering some sort of mental problem, emotional problem, or can parents read it to find out, well, this is a better way to interact with my child, and so that the child ends up being healthy.
You're right on target. What a wonderful statement. It is for anyone who is second guessing themselves.
Oh, okay.
Someone goes into adult and goes, gosh, I should be really happy. I've got everything I want. How come there's something wrong? Or, the parent says, gosh, I was a good parent, but how come my kid is doing what I did instead of, being healthy? I'm giving them all the advantages.
Right. Yeah.
So to make a wastebasket term, anyone who's second guessing themselves could benefit. And it's really helpful because my book just doesn't give you a simple method. It helps you understand why you're doing what you're doing,
Yeah.
how that applied to your upbringing, and then how do you change it?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh,
How do you get back to
yeah.
the child who got enough reinforcement for their thoughts, feelings, and ideas growing up? That is the key, that they can turn around at any age, an adult or a child. We have a child, 3 to 23. They can turn around and go back to getting the reinforcement that they might not have gotten enough of growing up. So they can now go into adulthood trusting the way they feel,
Okay.
following through with their ideas, and trusting their observations.
Okay. In my travels, I've come across certain people who obviously are having emotional problems. And I'll take one example, a woman that I used to know, very intelligent. I could tell she has a good head on her shoulders, but ended up in a dead-end job. And when pressed and talked, on a more intimate level, I found out that she went to her parents saying, I want to go to university. And her father says, what's the point? You're just going to get married and pregnant anyway. And just didn't go to university. And in the 70s, we had a saying that mind is a terrible thing to waste. And I think that was in reference to black universities and, black students having an equal shake. So what do you do with a person who is in their 60s and they fear that they may have had a wasted life and they could have made something better of themselves? Can this book help them?
Yes, and it will combine what you just shared with me about that individual and what we spoke about a moment before. How do these people know that they even need help? This is what happens with an individual who doesn't get enough reinforcement for their thoughts, feelings, and ideas.
Yeah.
The other component of the human brain, one is intellectual, one's emotional. What happens if they're dismissed or minimized? They start sitting on every time they have a feeling, they're dismissing and minimize the feelings. But neuromuscularly, those feelings build physically
Hmm.
and build up emotionally as they're dismissing or minimizing themselves in the way the parent did.
Okay.
What happens is that implosion from the dismissing or minimizing building up over years starts causing anxiety or depression or substance abuse, eating disorders, panic disorders, chronic pain,
Mm.
not because they don't love their parents. They didn't get a way to resolve each triggered feeling, one feeling at a time, one decision at a time, all day long. So that is all built up over the years and it's causing implosion. That would bring, hopefully, that person to seek out self help books or podcasts or a therapist
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
what to do differently. My method, which is very simple, teaches you to get back to reinforcing yourself, not criticizing the parents. So your brain has a new configuration on that old neuron track of not trusting themselves to go into life now trusting themselves, and it'll change their world.
Mm. Yeah. Since I had a brain aneurysm, and I don't remember having it, it happened. I passed out, but I have no recollection of it happening. I woke up in the hospital wondering where I was. Since then, I've sometimes wonder what caused it. And I know my life. I've had some turbulent times in the past. I'm happy, I'm contented now, but my 30s and 40s were just rough. And does the can this thing with the brain lead to medical problems aside from addiction problems, which of course, if you're addicted to drugs or, eating wrong food, that's going to make you sick. But apart from that, can the brain just make the body sick?
Well, let me answer that very carefully because I'm not an MD.
Mm.
But at minimum, that physical buildup of unresolved feelings or decisions can lead to repetition in areas of the body that break down. Like some people end up with a spastic colon, whereas other people might have migraines.
Yeah.
But what I'm going to be very careful about, it isn't everything. It can exacerbate situations that already occur
Okay.
because you're not getting the neurophysiology released. You're not getting the autonomic nervous system. You keep seeing me say this, which is part of the method. You resolve the physiology of the feeling, and then the cognition works really well. So that can build up physically in the body in certain areas.
Okay.
Because one of the things you may have noticed in the book, the first thing I ask people to do is notice where they light up physically or ignite when they're triggered to feel there's a reason, because those are the areas that will cue them right away that they need to pause and listen to their knowing. Plus, when they go through a feeling, it resolves the physiology so it doesn't build all day long and keeping exacerbating areas where they usually hold tension.
Okay. All right. You mentioned triggered. I recently discovered something called CPTSD, complex PTSD, and I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Mhm.
What exactly is that, and does that play a role in any of these writings that you have?
Absolutely, it does. There'll be a description in the book and what you read of it is never one triggered feeling that's a problem. That when a feeling is triggered, every time you felt that way before in your past can jump on board and make an feeling enormous physically to resolve and emotionally to resolve.
Hmm.
So PTSD is automatic unconscious. What I'm trying to do for your listener is make it conscious every time the automatic unconscious jumps on board by people noticing first where they react physically is the first indicator. Yeah, there's a feeling got triggered, but the past jumped on board and
Yeah.
a way to resolve that and use that in their decision making. The neurophysiology of emotion is very important to resolve, as well as having the ability to make good decisions and trusting and having self confidence.
Yeah,
Both are very important.
for sure. I hear the word feeling mentioned a lot, and decisions mentioned as well in listening to you speak. I- Is there a way that, or would you say that feelings shouldn't necessarily help you make decisions? You got to be, we have to be careful with our feelings. Am I right? I'll say this. I watch a lot of stuff, podcasts and YouTube, and the American elections. They really fascinate me. I'm Canadian, but it's a fascinating thing. And America is a very important country in this world. And sometimes I hear people with those red hats say that they felt that the election was rigged. They felt it. And to me, I think that that's a useless term. Like, I don't care what you felt. The facts are facts, but feelings, from your perspective, are very important. Is there a point where feelings start to be a problem?
Well, let me try to answer your first question. If people are using vocabulary, they may not be connecting with their feelings at all. They may be repeating and dependent on what other people are telling them.
Right. Okay.
Um, Feelings are very important because if you don't identify and resolve the feeling each time it's occurred, it builds up and causes what we talked about before,
Hmm.
anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, etc.
Okay.
Uh, the interesting thing about the addition to the brain in my method is if you avoid your feelings, guess what happens? Every time you're triggered to feel and you don't go through the identified feeling that's there, you run from it or say, oh, I'm fine. What happens, or more importantly, what doesn't happen, is the brain doesn't configure in the way it's designed because when we're triggered, this is what happens in our brains. The feeling gets triggered. If we go through it, your brain automatically and unconsciously configures every time you felt that way before, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, everything it knows about you or a situation in nanoseconds. The brain puts together how you feel in the moment if you don't avoid your feelings.
Hmm.
And every time you felt that way before, and it spits out our knowing or words or ideas of what we could do so we don't feel those ways again. We don't repeat those patterns that didn't work for us again. If people don't have a method like I've developed to go through a feeling and activate that brain memory recall, they go up in their head and intellectualize and try to figure out the perfect thing to say or do,
Okay.
but they're not getting memory retrieval or how they feel involved with the decision.
Hmm. Hmm. Of course, you're in the business of helping people compassionately and figuring out all this wonderful stuff, writing the book, having a podcast there to help people, and I applaud that. There must be some people who don't need this book, don't need your help because they're doing fine. Would you say that there's a certain percentage of the population that is just doing fine?
You know, this is a wonderful question. I had a family member recently who asked me, well, you know, what if you don't need it? You know, what happens if you don't need your book? The reason you wouldn't need my book is that in your early years of development, you got supported for every thought, feeling, or idea you had. There's no problem with trusting your emotional instincts and you make great decisions. There's something else though. There's another layer that if when you were growing up, you got permission to have your feelings, then you're not going to have a deficit of not knowing how to identify, manage, and resolve feelings. It won't be there.
Mhm.
So for those lucky people who got reinforced in their entire upbringing and don't have to do it later in their life, they may not need the book. The only reason I can think of is many people who work with me say, oh, I want to send this to my cousin because she could use this book, or my children could really learn from this method. How do I interact with my children? So the book maybe not be for them because they're healthy and they're
Mhm.
listening to themselves and their body and brains are working well, but they can often think, well, I can think of someone who always calls me and I try to help them, but I can't. Maybe they could use your book
Yeah.
because I know I don't have control over other people, that
Yeah.
type of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've done a lot of work. You were a doctor. That took a lot of work to get to that point. You clearly are a professional in your field. There are armchair critics, people who just they think they know what they're talking about. One person comes to mind that I crossed paths with in my life, who said, and they weren't a psychologist. They had no creds at all like that. They said, "There's only two feelings in this world," and I said, "Really?" I would imagine there's more than two, but what two are you talking about? Love and absence of love. Does that make sense?
In a way, that's what I was referencing with the family member, a very bright physician. He said, well, what about, love? What about those feelings? And I said to him, the issue is that you can feel those things, but some people can't feel anything. They're taught to shut down in early development, listening to any feelings they have. And those are the people that might be getting in trouble and
Okay.
need some assistance to getting back on track in the way the brain's designed to work.
Okay. So then is anger a feeling?
Anger, this is a great question. We feel our feelings or we don't feel our feelings. We react to our feelings or we go through them and respond.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah,
What I
yeah,
just said? Okay.
yeah,
There, if you don't feel feelings, you're going to be kin to reacting and making maybe not good choices.
yeah.
If you can go through and pause and let the brain configure it and figure it out and suggest what to do differently, you're likely to respond by using your feelings, not react by a buildup of feelings.
Okay. Your book is called Drop, and then it says making great decisions. What does drop mean?
Drop is a methodology that uses neuroscience and the way the brain is designed. And let me simply try to explain it to you. When you or I are triggered by people, situations, second guessing ourselves, thoughts, memories, the first thing the brain does is not cognitively informed. The brain doesn't come up right away and say, oh, you're angry, you should do this. By the time cognition comes in, feelings have already either passed the opportunity to feel them or gotten so large you just want to run from them. The brain does supply what you or I or your audience needs, though, because when we're first triggered, the first thing the brain does is ignite us physically, unique to you, increased heart rate, holding breath, rolling your eyes, wanting to walk out of a room. Each individual has specific areas in their body that uniquely ignite to indicate they've been triggered to feel. So that is the first step. And that shift to notice where they're lighting up physically, guess what that does? It stops you reading other people, it stops you second guessing yourself, and it stops you from running from your feelings.
Yeah.
The second step is to, once you've noticed you're lighting up, if you simply drop back to neutral, sitting back with yourself until those physical areas go back to neutral, that's what activates the brain's memory recall to configure in nanoseconds every time you felt this way before, what worked, what didn't, and what to decide. That dropping to the blank screen, we call it, back to neutral, also resolves the physiology of that one triggered feeling, and it allows you to use the brain to configure how you feel and every time you felt before to resolve the emotion. So you're resolving physically by dropping to the blank screen or neutral,
I see.
and you're resolving the emotion by making a decision. Emotions aren't resolved by, oh, I felt my feelings and that's it. You
Yeah.
have to go through the feeling and sit with your knowing long enough to make a decision. Once you make a decision, guess what? The brain doesn't have to keep bringing up the memory or the issue over and over again, because it knows you resolved it by deciding what you were going to say or do then, or if you ever feel that way again.
Yeah.
What is very unique about this method that's different from mindfulness, meditation, brain stimulation, everything that's going on to lower the volume of feeling physically or emotionally, is those volumes of feelings will come right back unless you have a way of completely
Yeah.
resolving those triggered feelings physically and emotionally, in my words, by making a decision, listening to that knowing. And that's how the brain is designed to work. We wouldn't have a brain that was designed to keep us triggered and
Yeah.
never feel resolution.
Sure. Of
So
course.
I've developed a method that mimics that exactly in my studies and in my working with people and studying neuroscience by
Hmm.
making a decision. There's a lot of wonderful neurologists and therapists and books and podcasts, but listen, they give you these wonderful advice, but they don't teach you how to do it, or they don't teach you how to resolve the feeling.
Hmm.
They lower the threshold of the emotion physically and emotionally so you feel better and back in the moment. But the emotion is going to come back. Why? Because the brain will keep bringing it up as it's designed until you make a decision.
Well, that explains a lot. I went through a mindfulness period of my life and yoga and qigong, and we did body scans, just lying there while a nice voice is telling us to feel our toes and so on and so on. Always felt great. And then I get in my car and drive home and go back to life and kind of forget that I was feeling really good before and until I do it again. But your book, your method takes it to the next step, I take it, and
Yeah.
teaches you not to slip back and I guess backslide or whatever the word would be.
The other important thing, and as you started this conversation, armchair people looking at what I'm doing, another issue that I feel very strongly about that people may disagree with is when you're triggered, if you go up into your head and try to figure out the perfect thing to say or do cognitively, the brain won't configure the memory recall. So the first thing you have to do is go through and trigger the memory recall and then think about what you would do. If you're up in yourself, in your head, talking yourself into breathing or relaxing or trying to figure out what to do, the brain is busy cognitively and it won't kick in and incorporate memory recall in what you decide to say or do. So
Yeah.
the first step is always to shift and notice where you're lit up physically, drop to neutral as the brain's configuring. And by the time you reach that neutral position where your heart rate is no longer beating or you're not grabbing your fist anymore, it's back to normal. That's when you can trust any words that come in because the brain has gone through the feeling and every time you felt that way before and is going to spit out suggestions or words or ideas of what you could do so you don't feel those ways again.
Okay. Properly practiced, would religion or spirituality help someone?
I'm going to be very broad in my answer.
Sure.
The reason we drop to the blank screen is to get memory retrievals of what works for us. So, of
Yeah.
course, if the individual has had experiences, religious or with other therapists or podcasts or method that have worked for them, that's going to be incorporated in the memory recall and suggestions of what they should say or do again, or
Hmm.
not say or do again.
Yeah.
So we're not going to be against all the learning people have done in their life or therapy or podcasts they've listened to. We're just adding two final steps that are very important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds great. You and I both know that we live currently in a world where large swaths of the population are just not thinking correctly and calling people names and just being rude and mean to each other. What's your view on all this negativity in our society? Obviously, you must notice it, right?
I do, of course. There's two variables that are very important. It's who you were raised by,
Hmm.
and did they have a tendency to criticize or be unkind to you or their spouse or other people?
Hmm.
That's one factor that can recreate every time we're triggered. We can flip into being our parents and not even realize it, which is
Yeah.
part of the book and the
Right.
reason for the method to stop that. Um, the other thing is, do you, even though you're a kind person, emerge into adulthood listening to these people do this and thinking that they're right over being kind and being yourself? So some people get drawn into that, number one, because they were used to it from their upbringing. And
Yeah.
number two, they never learned how to think for themselves or compromise
Mm.
ideas or differences and negotiate. So they're attracted to the people who are going to tell them what to do, not the people who might have them, practice listening to themselves and compromise and making decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to work with a lot of young people. They were my assistant editors. And I remember this one time I was talking to this young person. I was in my mid 50s and she was maybe like mid 20s and she was my assistant. And we were talking about being true to yourself. And I didn't even have to think about it. I just said, well, that's great. I mean, I agree. We should be true to ourselves, but I think it's important to know who we are so we know what to be true to. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, that if you don't have an awareness of when your brain is signaling you to listen to yourself, your own thoughts, feelings, and ideas, um, then you're constantly reading other people for what to say or do instead of yourselves. But it's going to change who you attract. If you have the ability to pause, listen to your brain, and make decisions, that attracts people who also have self-esteem, we call it, who is, well, that person seems to know themselves. I really would like to know more about them. If we have the opposite, where we have dependency on reading or taking care of or resolving other people's issues, or resolving our feelings from helping others, then we start attracting people who don't think for themselves and don't listen to themselves. Low self-esteem attracts low self-esteem, a dependency on reading others. High self-esteem for decisions. High self-esteem attracts high self-esteem. It's just amazing. People read, they can smell it if you have self-esteem or low self-esteem or not. And that's one of the things so many people I've worked with really appreciate. It doesn't say kick out the people you love in your life, but it affects how they're being treated by them.
Tell me about your podcast. What do you do there?
Well, the podcast is examples of people who were never my clients, just people that volunteered to give examples of how exactly to use the method in different situations. Difficult people, with children, athletics, performance, particularly difficult people, um, at work, in their family systems, in raising children, it's giving great examples in the podcast of using the method and interacting back and forth, first with that low self-esteem response, me teaching them the method, and then
Hmm.
them having the high self-esteem response. So it's very interesting.
Cool. When did you write this book?
When did I start? It must have
Sure.
been 3.5 years ago.
Okay. It took you a few years to get it together?
Well, it's a long process with many
It is.
people involved.
For sure.
You know, you're so lucky. You're a great editor. I'm a better speaker than I'm editor. So it takes me longer to get from what I want to say or do onto the written page than just verbalizing it. So it took a while. But you want to be sure that I may have a way of saying something, but I want to be sure this book is for not for me, it's for other people
Hmm. Yeah.
to get interested in. Maybe there's a possibility of doing something a little different, or attracting different kind of people, or being better at sports, or my children emerging into adulthood with self-esteem. So it's for them. So I really took my time to be sure it was understandable. And
Right.
that's difficult. You must know in writing for someone to get what you're trying to say, much less teach you a new technique for your brain to learn and take over in their own brain.
Okay. Do you have a practice where you have patients that you deal with
Yes,
on a regular basis?
yes, for
Okay.
years you do.
Okay. And this book, does that play a role in that, or would that be a conflict of interest?
That would be a conflict of
I
interest.
think
Yeah.
so. Pretty cool. Well, are you planning to write any more books?
No, but I do want to go back to your question.
Okay.
Um, for years, the people who persuaded me to write a book about this method, since there was not anything like it out there, were the people I worked with. Well, this really worked for me, but my sister in Idaho needs this too. So, not only by people who work with me, but when I would work in a clinic and I'd teach groups on how do you manage feelings, or the doctors or psychologists I'd work with to say, gosh, you've got to write a book because this could really help a lot of people. So that's why I wrote the book. And it was last on my list because I love to work with people clinically, but I think it's really important. I think my job now, since you ask, is not to write another book, but keep the blogs going, keep the examples going, keep reaching out so people know that there's an option to do two things. Number is to understand why they're doing what they're doing and how to
Mhm.
change it if they need to.
Yeah.
That's my heart. That's everything I want to do in my
Good.
life.
Good. I've heard it said that everybody has at least one book in them, and this is yours. Very good. Well, before we go, why don't you give us a pitch for your book? And out there, people are going to be watching this and listening, and when they want to know where to buy it, and why should they buy it? I think we've covered that already, but just give us one final pitch before we wrap this up.
If you can't read yourself correctly, you can't read other people correctly. That's one concept. And the book is not just for people with difficulty with, depression or anxiety. It's for anyone who has difficulty with executing and being who they want to be and doing things the way they want to do it. So that's what I would say. Um, the website, as you've mentioned several times, helenmckibben.com, gives you wonderful examples of maybe furthering their interest and what the book's about and how they could use it. And to buy the book, it's on all the major Amazon, Barnes and Noble, other various sites. And the thing about the book, because I'm trying to reach so many people, there's 3 editions. It's audio, audiobook, print book, and the ebook. So they can even be companion pieces. If people have a learning style that's auditory over reading, they can read it and listen to it at the same time, that
Yeah.
type of.
Did you voice the audiobook?
Yes,
Okay,
I
it's always good. I mean, I like the author voicing it in most cases. Well, that was great. Well, I hope you had a good time. I sure did.
I had a wonderful time.
Yeah, that was really good. I won't ask you if you write another book to be on the show because by the sounds of it, you're busy with the blog and your podcast, and I wish you all the success in that. But
Thank you.
if you do feel the urge to write another book and I'm still around, why don't you contact me and we'll get you back on here again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was
Okay.
a pleasure.
All right, Mike. Same here. All right. You take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, and if you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then I invite you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and even leave a comment if you wish. And if you are an author, I would sure love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing, and remember to be kind to one another.